Hello, everybody. So for today's video, we're going to be looking at the election of 1932 and the emergence of the New Deal coalition under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, as I will be referring to him from this point onward. Um, Basically, by 1932, as I've established in my previous video, things were not good in the United States. They were really, really bad, in fact. Not only do you have record high unemployment, over 13 million people, nearly 13 million people unemployed, over 25% of the population out of work, but you also have just absolutely massive suffering on a human scale, unlike anything seen before in this country, both in terms of the severity and the longevity of the suffering. Um, you know, Millions of people have lost their homes in addition to their jobs. Um, there's hunger throughout the land. Even though, you know, farmers are producing record amounts of produce every year, millions of people are going home to bed every night hungry, unable to feed their children, in many cases digging through the trash and garbage, pulling off maggots off of, really gross, kind of decaying fruit and vegetables to, make something so that they can eat. Living in shanty towns that crop up in cities throughout the United States, which come to be known as Hoovervilles, which is in and of itself a reflection of the general discontent and general anger directed at the sitting president, Herbert Hoover. Um, and millions more taking to the rails or the roads as hobos trying to find whatever work they can, going from town to town, basically begging to be given whatever kind of menial task or job they can do just to put enough food in their belly for one day. And, you know, it's at this time where you need a strong response from the government. It's times like these that you have governments for that reason. And Hoover, to his credit, he does try to do some things. He increases public work expenditures to a greater level than any American president up to that point had done, and he does try to some what today would be called pump priming, um, actions to try to restart and regenerate the economy. But he's unwilling to provide anything in the way of direct relief. He's unwilling to provide food or cash payments that might keep people from, say, losing their homes or um, being able to put food on the table or things like that. And so Hoover's insistence that these things be done by private charities or by state and local governments leads to a situation where those state and local governments and private charities are completely swamped. They're just simply unable to meet the massive need produced by the Depression and to address the scale. Only the federal government has that ability. But in spite of this objective reality, Hoover steadfastly and stubbornly resists any and all efforts to provide any kind of direct relief to people, fearing that it would be both something that would sap the individualistic nature of American society, that it would ultimately bring about, kind of serve as a gateway to socialism, if you will. His unwillingness to tackle this issue head on and provide relief where it is needed most creates a very, very volatile situation. As I've mentioned in the previous videos, people become increasingly militant. They, go to farm auctions with shotguns to discourage people from buying farms from their neighbors, these penny sales. Um, People like Bonnie and Clyde and Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger become folk heroes because people see them as, modern day Robin Hoods because they're robbing banks. The fact that they're also cold blooded killers in many cases oftentimes kind of, gets kind of swept under the rug there because people, again, are so angry that they're not willing to see that aspect of it. Um, And, more radically speaking, people become so fed up with the failure of capitalism that an increasing number begin turning to more radical alternatives, joining the Communist Party, embracing various, kind of fascistic ideas. So there's a very real fear in 1932 that not only is America becoming increasingly lawless because of the Depression, but that American democracy itself um, might not survive the Depression because of the uh, just absolutely lackluster response of the federal government in the face of the suffering. Um, and that, of course, reaches its apex with the Bonus Army March in the summer of 1932. So, into that dynamic of a society on the verge of collapse, of American democratic institutions, in a very very fragile state, with many Americans ready to embrace revolution in some form or another. We get Franklin Delano Roosevelt um, securing the Democratic nomination for president in 1932. Um, Roosevelt is in many ways somewhat of an unlikely populist, an unlikely folk hero, and an unlikely champion of working class people that he comes to be associated with. Much like his famous cousin Theodore Roosevelt, uh, Franklin Roosevelt is born into this very fabulously rich old money family in New York that's been a fixture of, elite society in the Northeast since the 1640s. And he's raised in very privileged circumstances. Um, and his initial career didn't really demonstrate that much of a aptitude for helping the public. Although Roosevelt ultimately chose to pursue his political future in the Democratic rather than Republican Party, his early career trajectory actually is remarkably similar to that of his cousin Theodore. Um, like Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt is a advocate of conservation. He's also a strong advocate of a very of a powerful navy. And so, to that end, during the Wilson administration, Franklin Roosevelt becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the exact same position that Theodore Roosevelt had held prior to shipping off to fight in the Spanish-American War and lead the Rough Riders. So his career trajectory is very similar to his cousin. In 1920, recognizing his talents and his political skills, he actually becomes the Democratic vice presidential nominee under James M. Cox, which is a failed ticket. It ends up losing to Republican Warren G. Harding that year. But his political future seems pretty bright. However, just a year after the election, Roosevelt is vacationing off of the coast of New Brunswick, Canada, and he comes down with the poliomyelitis virus. He survives this. Many people didn't, but he survives it, and so that's good. But he does lose the use of his legs. He's basically paralyzed in his legs as a result of his, um, of getting the polio virus. And so that immediately throws the question of his political future and his, at that point, ascendant political career into question. And for a time, it does put it on the back burner. Um, but over time, Roosevelt's disability, which he went to great lengths to conceal throughout his remaining public life, having specially made braces made so that he could stand for periods of a time using his upper body strength, having his adult sons, basically walk him around so that he could give the appearance of walking, um, and various other kind of stunts to conceal it. There's actually comparatively few photos of him in his wheelchair. But in spite of his disability and in spite of his very clear sensitivity about how it would affect his perception, Roosevelt's disability, in fact, proves to be in some ways very beneficial for him, both politically and in terms of shaping the kind of leader he will become. Politically, it's beneficial for him because um, he begins receiving treatments for polio in the South, in Warm Springs, Georgia, specifically, to try to restore some usage in his legs. And in the process of undergoing those treatments, he develops very close contacts with Southern Democratic officials and politicians. This makes Roosevelt someone who's kind of at the time unique in the Democratic Party. He's able to fuse together those two very different wings of the Democratic Party that exist at the time: the northern, liberal, urban, immigrant-driven wing of the party, which he himself represents and comes from, and the southern, rural, conservative wing of the party that is, in many ways, two separate political entities that just kind of come together in a very haphazard fashion every 4 years to try to choose a president, which is one of the reasons why they lose frequently at this point in American history, because there's such a very clear difference in ideology and philosophy between the two wings of the party. As famous Oklahoma humorist um, said, I am a member of no organized political party. I am a Democrat, which is a statement that in many ways is still true today. But anyway, so Roosevelt or FDR is able to forge these political connections in the South that make him able to build a certain crossover appeal. But beyond that, the sense of loss and the kind of the sense of how just kind of losing everything and having his entire world turned upside down that occurs for Roosevelt or FDR as a result of his polio gives him a very rare characteristic, not just for politicians of the time period, but for politicians of any period. And that is that he has a great deal of empathy for the suffering of everyday people. Now, again, coming from this very, very wealthy background, he doesn't experience the kind of privations caused by the Depression that many working class and poor people do. But he does have at least some understanding of personal loss and, things happening to you beyond your control. And that ultimately will help him build this very, very strong and in many cases very intimate and personal connection with people during his presidency. Now, after a few years kind of in the wilderness, so to speak, Roosevelt runs for the governorship of New York in 1928, replacing the Democratic governor Al Smith, who that year ran unsuccessfully for the presidency. And pretty much like Hoover, just as soon as he takes office, the Depression hits, or very shortly thereafter. But unlike Hoover, FDR's governorship in New York becomes in many ways a model for how the country should respond to the Depression. He, takes bold actions. He expands social services, provides greater relief, expands public works programs, and really New York becomes at that point a model for a potential way of handling the Depression. And so in 1932, in the face of all of the suffering and uncertainty that the Depression had created, Roosevelt secures the Democratic nomination. And he campaigns on a very vague and at the time undefined slogan, the New Deal. When Roosevelt campaigns in 1932, he promises the American people a New Deal. Now, what he means by the New Deal, even he does not know necessarily at the time. Contrary to what many people have kind of retroactively, kind of applied to him in terms of his ideology and worldview, Roosevelt wasn't really advocating a specific ideology or a specific set of solutions or to problems at the time period. He just has this idea that we're going to try to do things to fix the country and try to help working people, and And so he promises very little more than what he calls bold and persistent experimentation. The specifics of his plans are not fully realized at the time of the 1932 election. But it doesn't matter. Um, Hoover is unpopular enough because of the, again, widespread, if not necessarily accurate, public perception of his indifference to the suffering caused by the Depression. And so Roosevelt ends up winning, or FDR winds up winning a landslide victory, at the time the biggest landslide in American history, with over 57% of the popular vote in 1932. In the process, he has created a new political paradigm and a new political coalition known as the New Deal Coalition that will end up being massively influential on American politics for decades, and in some ways is still quite influential. Um, Basically, the New Deal Coalition brought together, like I said, these two very disparate wings of the Democratic Party, as well as many people who had previously been Republican voters. So it basically brings together um, working class, oftentimes first or second generation immigrant families in the North and big cities. This liberal, kind of wing of the party. It brings together advocates of labor and unions. Eventually, it'll include African Americans in that mixture in the North. And then you also have in the South farmers, um, and rural white conservatives. So it's a very, very broad coalition. Some of the people in the New Deal coalition are basically socialists. Others are quite conservative, both socially and economically. But they're all brought together under the umbrella of the New Deal and under the umbrella of FDR and the Democratic Party. And that'll prove to be a very durable political coalition. Um, it'll exist long after FDR's death in 1945 and continue to be a very powerful force in American politics, really all the way up until the early 1980s. So this is a very kind of important moment in American politics and the evolution of American politics, and brings about this new political paradigm that'll endure for a fairly long period of time. Now, then the question is, what's Roosevelt going to do? What's FDR going to do once he's in office? And that is sort of an open question at that point. When FDR is inaugurated in 1933, in March 1933, he's the last American president, incidentally, to be inaugurated in March. There's a new constitutional amendment that had been passed in the interim that ever after would change the inauguration day to January 20th instead of March the 4th. Which is a reflection of the intense unpopularity of Hoover, incidentally. And in his inauguration speech, FDR says, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." So he starts off his presidency with this very bold kind of proclamation of trying to tackle the many issues brought about by the Great Depression. And what would follow after this is a period of whirlwind activity that has since become the yardstick, the metric by which all American presidents, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, have been judged ever since. A period of intense legislative and governmental action that sees the creation of massive new programs and incredibly ambitious efforts to tackle the causes of the Depression that comes to be known as the 100 Days. And that is going to be the subject of the next video. It's going to be looking at some of the things that are done during the 100 Days and looking at both the successes and failures of that period.